Hello everyone. Today's lecture is going to focus on an area of machine learning and material science that's different from all the ones we've discussed before, and that is using natural language processing techniques for reading, understanding, and extracting information out of papers. So the real motivation for using computing to help out in understanding the scientific literature is really the scale of scientific literature. This is a chart from a recent report from the National Science Foundation that showed how in 2018 there were 2.5 million science and engineering articles published. And this is a trend that's been growing steadily over time. They could show that was only 1 million back in 1996. And the way that I look at this is I have a little over 1,000 articles in my Mendeley, and it would be generous and probably deceptive of me to claim that I have mastery over even half of them. I understand what a few are. I can't speak to every conclusion drawn in each of the papers, nor where to find particular data that I'm looking for. And this is a challenge. There's only so much you can read through in papers, and I'd argue that even in 1996, with only 1 million papers published per year, we were already past a point of where any single human could be able to understand even all of the papers that are published in their field. So considering this broad scale of challenge of being able to parse through a lot of information, one might think computers would be a great way to solve this problem, to make kind of sense of all of the natural text that is in all of these papers published each year. And the real question of that comes down to how. So if we take a look in defining any kind of machine learning problem, our first step is to define the kind of tasks that we'd hope to solve using that machine learning tool. And you can think of things at the very basic level of, say, I don't want to be able to describe the information in these papers, but I just want to make them easy to sort through, where I can search by meaning rather than text. So say if I search for polyethylene, it'll know that, okay, the papers you're interested in could talk about HDPE as an example, and be able to do that sort of contextual search. And this is something you might be using every day with something like Google. There's also information extraction, where I just pull the information out of the text and don't make any kind of assertions about what it might mean. And then more kind of reasoning intensive types of NLP, where I can give it a paper and say it can produce a short summary of it or answer questions about it, or even, and this is kind of one of the holy grails of being able to do natural language processing on a computer, is being able to logically reason about the data that it's reading, say to be able to identify conflicting ideas or very interesting concepts within the literature, or even test theories that are proposed by a human against the data and ideas available in a paper. Of all of these contexts, really the one that's made a lot of headway within the materials and chemistry community is information extraction, and it's one that also illustrates a lot of the techniques that are used within natural language processing. So that's going to be the focus of our lecture today. And before we talk about the specific uses of NLP within materials and chemistry, we'll talk first about the basics of how one goes about doing information extraction on natural text. And just for clarity, I've been using the term natural text a lot in this lecture already, and that's to describe text that's generated by humans, not by an algorithm. So if I think about this challenge of information extraction, I can actually break it down into many different steps, all dedicated towards the goal of being able to take a, again, natural sentence that a human wrote. High-density polyethylene has a class transition temperature of negative 110 C, and turn that into a structured data, like the example that I've shown on the right, that contains that form in a hierarchical data structure, which of the kind that computers are very good with working with. And if I think about how I would go about understanding and getting that information out of this text, I do two different steps. The first of which is I identify kind of named entities, particular words that are important for understanding that text. Now, the first of which is polyethylene. I know that to be a name of a polymer. And the second of which is glass transition temperature, which is a property of a polymer. And now that I have these two kind of lynch points of the sentence defined, my next step is to do relationship extraction, where I take these entities and I assign or I learn what information the sentence says about them. So, for example, I can see that polyethylene is modified with an adjective high density. So I can assign a characteristic to polyethylene that is high density. Glass transition temperature is linked to a value -110 that has units of Celsius. And then finally, I can see that the polyethylene is linked to glass transition temperature, and I can combine all of these relationships together and encode them in a structured form like the one that I have on the right, that can take all of these information, do some encoding perhaps to make them easier to understand, like I can define a structure where I have materials, have a category property that has a unit TG, which I can use as a shorthand for glass transition temperature if I know those two words are synonyms, and that gives me something that's very computable. Alright, so let's break down these challenges step by step, and we're going to focus mostly on named entity recognition. So named entity recognition is a supervised learning problem in that I have a function that I'm defining, something that takes a word or text and defines categories for them, like taking this example of a finance article and being able to identify, say, which words in here are geopolitical entities or GPE, which ones are organizations, and be able to mark up the text with each time one of those appears. And this is actually a very challenging text to read through. They've got a lot of words that are kind of misunderstandable. Okay, this one actually doesn't have apple in it, but you can imagine apple has a lot of synonyms. In some contexts, they're fruit. In other contexts, they're companies. Interestingly, they identify AI as a person in one category and a geopolitical entity of another, so you can see how this technique here was using the context to realize that the same word may have represent different entities depending on its context. And hopefully this goes to illustrate really the challenges that one has to go through in being able to do these kind of NER. Where really at the core of it is, the question you might have is, how do I go about building each of these models in the first place? Because I know that a machine learning tool, when I'm learning supervised or performing supervised learning, requires some features to describe the inputs. And that's where word embeddings come into play. So word embeddings are based on the idea that one of the simplest ways that I could encode words into features is using a technique called one-hot encoding, where I create a number of features equal to the number of words that I have. Say if I have 4 words, canoe, ship, bike, and car, I assign each of them one of 4 features, where it's 1 if it's mapped to a certain word and 0 otherwise. And this is great. I've checked the box. I now have some numerical representation of the words that I can start working with things like TensorFlow that operate with numbers, not with words. And the problem with this is the number of features that I have, it scales with the number of words that I have. And for English text, you can easily come up with 500,000 words in a category. So that's a huge number of words to deal with, and that causes some computing challenges. And additionally, it's very information lean. Nowhere in this text is it encoded that canoe is closer to ship than it is to car. Rather, I can go about learning embedding for words, where instead of using a single feature for each of the words, I use a smaller number of features that in some way encode the relationships between those words. For example, I could define 2 axes, one of buoyancy, another of size, and I could see that, okay, a bike is closer to canoe because they're both smaller than cars and boats, but a boat is more buoyant than a car So it's both different on two categories. Car is closer because it's similar in size, and it's also not buoyant. And here we can see that now if I wanted to build a decision engine that, say, identify the words that are terrestrial vehicles, I could create a very simple machine learning model along that buoyancy axis. So great. If I could only come up with these kind of word embeddings that capture some contextual meaning about these words rather than just expressing them as completely orthogonal to each other, I could go about training machine learning models. So our next question is, how can I go about creating such embeddings in as large of a space of all available words? As I mentioned, there could be 500,000 in a set of text, and that's just too much to be able to go through as a human. The way that we do this in practice is based on the idea that related words are found in similar contexts throughout many sentences. So that if I say find two words that are always described in similar ways, like I took a boat to the island or I took a canoe to the island, I could be able to infer without any effort from a human that these two words are more similar. And there are many ways of going about, say, taking the context of of different words throughout many samples of text. And one of them that we're going to use to illustrate this concept is called skipgram. So it's described by Jay Alamore's blog on this subject, which I'll also note, superb taste in sci-fi book references, details the key process of building up these embeddings with skipgram. So the first thing I do is I take a lot of examples of words in text. Say I go to Wikipedia and download all of the articles. I then go about making positive examples of words that are found in context with each other. I can say, as in this example on the right with a quote from Dune, I can take a list of 5 words and I can mark that, okay, not is near to the word thou, which is it's also near to the word shout, make, and a. So it gives me positive examples of words that are associated with each other. And I can do this for many different texts, and I can use that to build up a lot of training examples for a model that predicts the context of a word. I then also can generate a lot of negatives by, say, sampling random words from the text and use those as examples that are not found near each other. And then with these examples, I can train a classifier that learns embeddings for the words. So the way that I do this is I start off with assigning each word a random set of features that describe it, a so-called random embedding. Then I train a simple model where I take a batch of those positive and negative examples. I take their 2 embeddings and I multiply them together. I take that and I run it through a sigmoid model, which converts that dot product, which gives me a single number, into a range between 0 and 1. And then I take the error between that and my target value, where 1 could represent words that are related, 0 represents words that are not. And by taking that error signal and using the kind of iterative learning techniques like gradient descent that we use for neural networks, I can go back and update the embeddings such that now that embedding will give me a prediction that's closer to my true labels. And if I run this many times, I can come up with good embeddings that describe each of the words and can adequately predict whether 2 words pulled out of that whole vocabulary of possible words are related or they're not. And this is something that's had an extreme amount of research on it. Skipgram is one of many techniques to do it that each have their own advantages, but Skipgram happened to be one that is not only simple, but had a great resource I could refer you to read about this in greater detail if you would like. All right, so at this point I've now been able to take my words and identify some features for them. The next step is to train a machine learning model. And there are a couple of ways I can go about that. So the first way I could do is I could just train a simple model. Given those features for a word, which here I'm denoting using the variable w, can I predict whether it is the certain entity, which I'm going to use the variable y for. So this is good. It's taking a set of features that capture how that word is described, but I could perhaps do better by using the words to either side of it. In that, I can say take 3 different inputs, the word before, the word, and the word after, and use those to predict whether that entity is or that word is one of my entities or not. An even better way is I can learn a model that kind of simultaneously takes all of the words in context by using the so-called recursive pattern, where I have a model that takes 2 inputs. One is the word that I'm currently looking at, and the other is some variable that describes the history of what I have seen in that sentence to date. And it uses both of them to generate a prediction of whether that word is the target entity or not. And also produce a new variable that describes the history of the sentence updated with the word that I just looked at, and that passes to the same model to run that same calculation on the next word in the sentence. And this technique is known as a recurrent network, or you might also hear the term RNNs, where this is a type of model that, as we just demonstrated, learns how some state describing a sequence changes as I move along the sequence. So, as illustrated in this picture here, taken from Wikipedia, it's composed of 3 functions. The first of which is an update function, and these are terms that I came up with to help me understand it, which takes the current feature that I've seen in a sequence, denoted by X, and uses it to update a state. I then have a propagation function that takes that state, which here we denote H, and updates it to provide a new history that describes how our sequence has evolved, or how what we know about the sequence has changed. And then a final term called W, which I'm going to call the output function, which takes that state and uses it to predict some kind of output, which here, as in our NER example, could be a description of whether the word at that current position in the sequence is an entity or not. In this general framework for defining this kind of recurrent neural network, where I have a function that takes 2 inputs, the current data in the sequence and a history of what we have seen before, and produces 2 outputs, information about what we have seen, or about the specific point in the sequence, which here is denoted O, and an updated version of that history of the sequence. And these include techniques like the gated recurrent units or the long short-term memory objects, which each reflect these kind of different functions in increasingly complex ways. And one of the cool things about RNNs is you can use them in very different ways. I don't have to actually need both of the inputs or use both of the outputs from the model. I could say use these RNNs as just a simple one-to-one mapping where I ignore the fact that it has a history altogether. Or I could do a technique where I only use one entry from a sequence. Then I move only by propagating the history, and I use that to produce a sequence of data in a so-called one-to-many. I can also ignore the outputs except for the last one and produce a many-to-one. And there are many different variants in between, where you can imagine these many-to-manys could be used for, say, sentence translation. I first take a sequence of words in one language. I then have a state that encompasses, in some ways, the meaning of all the words that I have seen before, and then I use that state to roll out how to describe that concept within a different language. And this is actually how Google Translate works, using these kind of RNNs. If we think about it for NER, just to complete the circuit here, we can imagine I take my sentence that I described earlier, high density polyethylene has a glass transition temperature of -110 C. I first take each of those words and I transcode them to an embedding, which here I'm defining as W. I then pass them to an RNN, and here the cartoon that I'm showing is actually a bi-directional RNN, where instead of producing one history object that moves forward through the sequence, I produce a second one that moves back. And this helps me learn a model that, say, looks at the word coming after to be able to determine, say, an entity that's a noun often has a verb right after it. So if I can take a look ahead in the sequence, I can make an easier prediction about what that entity is. And then I pass all of these to a signal that's, say, a probability, and I can use that to go color my sequence to say, all right, there's a really strong chance that polyethylene is a polymer. There's only one other noun in the sentence. Well, actually there are two. The -110 is also a noun. Temperature could also be a polymer, but I'm less confident about it, so I can assign it a less of a probability score. And this is how many NER techniques work in the literature, using this kind of notion of words go to embeddings, go to model, which produces probability. There are also a few other variants that are good to know about. There are also character level RNNs, which avoid this challenge of every word in your sentence must have been seen before in order for it to have a word embedding. Rather, I can train a model that works entirely on characters. And this figure here is showing the output of one of these networks and predicting which letter should come next in a sequence based on some, there's a previous sentence of text where you can see that the first prediction it made, E was actually the second best choice, D was the fourth, and once it had been given those two letters, it predicted the rest of the sentence, I, E, C, T, E, D, or sorry, the rest of the word, ranking each of those letters as number one. And you can see we can go along the rest of the sentence, and this is comparing the actual sentence with the ranking of that letter when I've given all of the previous text. And you can see that it does a kind of really a shockingly good job of being able to identify which character is going to come next. So once it sees the word E, as an example, towards the end of the sentence, it knew that the letters following it must be Elizabeth. And these models are the kind used in practice. They're enormous. It takes a lot of data to train and a very complicated model to be able to learn how the English language works, looking at a character at a time. But you can do some rather amazing things. This is a blog I'd recommend you guys taking a look at if you're curious. But a guy got a hold of OpenAI's GPT-3 model, which was trained using this character level approaches, and it can do some really impressive question answering. My favorite of these four is the question, why don't animals have three legs? Which the human, Kevin Lacker, gave to this model, and the model told him animals don't have three legs because they would fall over, which seems like a very naturally human response, and in fact, kind of a clever one. Alright, so that wraps up our discussion of how NER technique works. The last word I want to put in is that there's a lot of use of NLP in regions beyond material science. So before you go about thinking that these techniques are ones you have to go implement yourself, Google around a little bit. You might find tools like Spacy or NLTK that'll help you work converting text into a form that's usable by machine learning, or indeed training some simple types of NLP models. Or you can even find pre-trained language models to avoid having to train your own word embeddings. So again, yeah, just keep in mind that NLP is something that is really pervasive throughout technology, so there are a lot of open source codes that can help you along your way. So at this point, we'll change gears slightly and talk about some of the recent history of NLP in materials engineering and chemistry, looking at some really exemplar work. So the first of which I'll talk about is a paper from 2016 from Swain and Cole out of Cambridge that showed how they could train a large engine of different types of computing to take papers and extract scientific data from them, like the melting temperature of compounds or the UV vis absorption spectra. And this work that they described actually solved a ton of different challenges in dealing with papers, even starting with things like, how do I take a PDF, be able to break it into its component parts of a paper, like what part of this text corresponds to the abstract or a figure caption or a table, and then pass them to the appropriate natural language processing techniques. And even within natural language processing, there are many different steps that have to go on in order to turn that bit of text into a simple designation of like label 3A in this paper corresponds to a certain chemical. And each of those different spots has a lot of challenges. So even splitting text into sentences is difficult, because not all punctuation characters actually mark the end of a sentence. You can consider the phrase "et al." appears a lot in scientific words, but the period there is an abbreviation, not the marker of an end of a sentence. So you have to train some clever logic to be able to even split up sentences into distinct entities. Additionally, breaking a sentence into words is difficult. The word polyethylene glycol, even though it has a space inside of it, is only one word, not two and not three, if you consider the parentheses often define breaks in words. Additionally, part of speech tagging is hard. The part of speech taggers that are available in tools like Spacie and NLTK are often trained on newspapers, where people went and annotated the part of speech for many news articles. There are also ones that are available on Medline abstracts. And there's also a question of, if I'm training that entity recognizer, what do I train that on as well? Do I train it on newspapers or medical abstracts? And so we're going to dig into one of these challenges in particular, although I note Cole and Swain do a fantastic job of describing all of these different tasks and how they implemented them and their logic behind why they made their decisions. So if you want to learn more, I highly recommend their paper. But the only one we're really going to talk about in detail is the named entity recognizer. So the named entity recognizer was trained using a dataset called CHEMDNER, or DNER, which is a labeled dataset of 10,000 abstracts where human scientists went through and annotated where are all of the different chemical mentions found. And this was a process that took a great amount of time. It took a lot of coordination between scientists in different groups to make sure how to do it right. But once they did it, they were able to release it to the community openly and actually use it to create a benchmarking challenge where 24 groups went through and took this data and different state-of-the-art natural language processing techniques and applied them to the data set. And that's shown in this table on the right. And you can notice that the majority of these studies use different machine learning techniques. A lot of them use kind of the same class of algorithms, the conditional random fields, which we're going to talk about in a second. And you can see how they varied in the different techniques that they applied. Another thing of note here is actually the third best performing technique was a rule-based one, where they predefined some rules just as humans that would describe what a chemical word looks like, and that was sufficient for doing quite well in this challenge. The approach that Swain and Cole took was one that was based on machine learning. They used a technique called conditional random fields, or CRF, which is a class of machine learning model that's actually worked on, or it's designed to work with sequence or graph-based data, where I take my, say, entire sequence of words and I use them together to make predictions about which words are a certain entity or not. And the kind of features that CRF model took included things like brown cluster indices, which brown clusters are another type of word embedding that you can learn with unsupervised learning, like what we described with skipgram earlier. And also some character level information, like noting that words with hyphens in them are often chemicals or things that include numbers and letters in them. And by building up these rich set of features and combining their approach with, say, a rule-based system that used regular expressions. Regular expressions are a way of defining patterns in text, or a dictionary that contained very commonly known chemicals. They could create a very good approach for identifying which words in their corpus were chemicals or properties or other kinds of meaningful nouns. So once they had this NER in place, they used a rule-based technique to define how these different named entities are related to each other. And this here shows their rules for defining how to map the name of a chemical to its label, where, say, a name is followed by a word that is the beginning of a chemical mention. That's what BCM identifies, and that's one of the types of entities that they tried to identify, followed by 0 or more in between, or I think it's intermediate chemical mentions. So that defines a rule that describes a name. Given a list of words in a sequence, I can quickly identify with this rule a name of a chemical is a beginning chemical mention followed by some intermediates. Then I can look at the labels, where I know that the label is a number followed by a letter, or a number or a letter followed by some parentheses, and the name is the combination of that word plus a parentheses plus a label plus a closed paren. And I can take that to a sentence that includes a phrase such as 1,2-dihydroxybenzene 3A, and be able to quickly assemble the name of that chemical and its label following this rule-based system. And they define, I can't think of how many of these different rules, in order to be able to take their now labeled sentences with those criteria, like beginning chemical mention, that are required to extract that information, and actually use that to pull out all of the information about how they're related to each other. There's been some more recent work on machine learning and for natural language that's come out of MIT. And this is a project called the Synthesis Project, where they actually have a full suite of NLP tools for reading text about inorganic chemistry, and particularly how these inorganic materials are created. They're not only the word embeddings that are used to work with that particular kind of text, or the name entity extractions, or the association engines, but they also release their labeled data sets available for other researchers to use. So it's not only a great example of kind of a full stack of how to go from starting with natural language text to named entity recognizers, through even machine learning models that can use that data to predict how to synthesize new materials, but it's also a really superb example of open science. So I'd really recommend taking a look at it and kind of considering it for a number of reasons. Another example of something rather cool you can do with natural language processing is just doing science with only those word embeddings. And a work out of Berkeley called the MatScholar project did just that, where they learned word embeddings based on the text of material science abstracts, and were able to take those embeddings and learn analogies from them, or at least be able to take a look at how different words are similar and use them to predict which materials might be good for certain applications. And one of the really cool examples from this paper is they took the word thermoelectric and they found which materials identified by their chemical compositions are closest to that word in their embeddings. And those embeddings are, again, what are learned about how those words appear in context. And they found that a lot of the words, if they looked at only a model trained on papers from the year 2000 or earlier, were thermoelectrics that were known at the time. But also 40% of those top 50 words also were thermoelectrics that were discovered after the year 2000. So even by looking at the text, despite that no one knew that these chemicals or these compositions were going to be those of thermoelectrics, it turned out that the way they were described encoded enough information that one could guess with really surprising accuracy that they were going to be promising thermoelectrics that just hadn't been discovered yet. So this really has kicked off a lot of interest in how we can allow machines to kind of take text and be able to, without any sort of human labeling effort, be able to help us solve scientific and engineering challenges. So the last thing I'll mention before I wrap up this lecture is, as we've hopefully illustrated, natural language processing is complicated, there are a lot of moving parts, and I can assert that none of these techniques are perfect. So there's been a lot of effort around the scientific community to ensure that information that's going into the literature is either easy to retrieve or already in a form that's accessible to machines. So one way that people do this is to define controlled vocabularies or ontologies that define words and how they are related to each other. A good example of this is the SNOMED ontology, which defines different medical terms and how they are related to each other, like heart attack is a synonym for myocardial infarction, and both of those describe the same concept, which can be annotated with others, like this is a disease of the heart that must be treated in certain ways. And the idea behind SNOMED is if people who write medical records are encouraged to use this terminology, we don't have to learn the meaning of these words automatically from text. There's no need for a word embedding because I can look up these words and be able to see what their actual defined meaning is and be able to use that to interpret the text. Another way, which is circumventing putting anything into human readable text to begin with, is to encourage scientists from the community to publish their data in a form that is already computer accessible. And the protein crystallography community is a great example of this. For 50 years they've had a data bank where people uploaded their computer format descriptions of the crystal structures of proteins in a computer readable format, so there's no ambiguity about what is meant. It's in an already documented form and we can already compute on it. We don't have to fool around with text. So that wraps up the lecture for today. What we've done is we've gone over the core concepts in natural language processing, where we've described some of the different steps and techniques that go into it, like how named entity recognition relies on embeddings for words and recurrent networks in order to understand how the sequence of words in a sentence can be used to infer their meanings. And then finally, we've illustrated how techniques like learning word embeddings can be used to predict scientific discoveries, or how natural language, named entity recognition and many other NLP techniques can be combined to extract chemical information from text.